everyone, and welcome to Literary Bridges Writers on Writing. Aldona Grupas and I am delighted to host today's episode together with my dear friend and co-host, Dr. David William Puddy. Today we have a truly remarkable guest, and I must say it feels like a dream come true for me. Professor Kevin Mills, one of the most famous voices in contemporary literary studies and poetry. Kevin Mills is Emeritus Professor of English Literature and Creative Writing at the University of South Wales, and the author of several influential books, including Justifying Language, Paul and Contemporary Literary Theory, Approaching Apocalypse, Myth and Ancient Stories, and many more. His research reaches across the centuries and disciplines with essays on H.G. Wells, Florence Nightingale, Charles Darwin, Christina Rossetti, the Brownings, Bob Dylan, and Roald Dahl. Kevin is also an acclaimed poet with 4 published collections, Full, Libra, Stations of the War, and Sigma. I'm sorry for my pronunciation. As a founder member of Contemporary Theatre, he brings history to life through poems and song lyrics written to theatrical productions. Professor Mills, we are honored and delighted to welcome you to Literary Bridges.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon, young lady. It's also a singular pleasure for me to have Kevin on this little show, this little experiment of ours. I mean, I met Kevin when I started the PhD at the University of South Wales. What a remarkable institution, despite what's going on there at the moment. I took to Kevin more or less instantly from the first discussion onwards, because I thought, my God, that's someone on the same wavelength. I can't believe that. So he's a friend of mine. He wasn't just my doctoral supervisor, my PhD supervisor. He became a friend of mine. And during that process, I learned a lot about his work, which twin streams, because it's good to know about who you're working with. And I found myself equally honoured to have met someone who became a friend who I can talk to, even me, weirdo me, about English literature. So it's a real pleasure for me as well, Kevin.
Thank you. Likewise.
Well, I hope you have a nice time on the show. And Aldona's gentle with you. I hope she doesn't go into a grilling mode. Aldona, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. And my first question to you, Professor Kevin. Could you begin by sharing what first drew you toward literature and literary theory? Was there a moment that shaped your path?
Apologies. I'll try without the headphones, see if that's any better. So you're asking what drew me to literary theory, I guess, yeah? Okay. I was a mature student. I didn't go to university until I was 26. And when I went to university, I found this course in Cardiff University, which was divided between linguistics and literary study. And that just kind of really appealed to me. And I ended up on a degree course, which was just absolutely wonderful. And it's a kind of degree course you don't get in this country anymore, really, because we covered such a wide range of stuff. We did linguistics, we did linguistic philosophy, we did literature, literary theory, we did European aesthetics all the way from Plato to Derrida. It was an amazing course and had fantastic teachers. And I think it was that there was stuff that I'd never come across before, particularly stuff like I was learning about linguistics and Ferdinand de Saussure and the history of kind of structural linguistics. And I just thought, I'd never thought about language like this before. I was always interested in language, I always loved language, but I'd never thought about it in this way before. It was a completely new thing to me. And I just got absolutely carried away by it. I thought this is amazing. It's fantastic stuff. Um, and that's where it started. The excitement was just there from the start when I discovered this material. And so when I came to do my PhD, I didn't want to work on anything else. I just thought, I love this stuff. This is what I've got to do. The flip side of that is that I grew up in a Christian home. My father was a Baptist minister.
Wow.
And so I'd thought a lot about interpretation and the way that, we read the Bible, how we make sense of the Bible, and so on. And that, in my experience, then was kind of confronted by literary theory, by these different approaches to interpretation. And so that's what my PhD was how do you get St. Paul's interpretation of the Old Testament to speak to Derrida's contemporary mode of reading? And it was a crazy thing to do, but at the time it was just extremely exciting, that's it really. It was just sheer enthusiasm, sheer excitement.
Okay, thank you. David, would you like to ask something?
Thank you. I mean, there's nothing wrong with sheer enthusiasm. I mean, Aldona, rather like you, amazes me. A nurse who writes, I just find that an extraordinary combination, particularly nowadays. Someone administering the mysteries of life to the poorly who reflects on that and writes stories. I think that's amazing. You, as a friend of mine, also amaze me. You kept the Baptist thing quiet. I'm always in two minds about Baptists for obvious reasons. I think it's important that we explore that a little, for the simple reason you and I both have not only a respect for the Bible as a literary document, but an intrigue at its materials, which comes out in the book of Job, which you and I have said to each other in the past. I mean, why is it even in the Bible?
Yes.
This unique document that sort of doesn't fit, and it fits perfectly. What do you think the Bible is in terms of literature, Kevin? And why is the book of Job even there?
Oh, huge questions, aren't they? One of the things that is kind of striking about the Bible, once you start to think about it in any way which isn't straightforwardly religious, is that it's not a unitary text. It is a collection of very diverse material, isn't it, which was produced over a long period of time. And one of the kind of fascinations for me is the way in which this kind of collection of extremely diverse material is kind of unified by the history of interpretation. It's interpretation, isn't it, which produces that kind of unity. And it's partly, I suppose, it becomes a kind of culture shaping thing, doesn't it? Because of years and years, centuries of interpretation, layers upon layers of interpretation, all the way back from Paul reading the Old Testament, reading the Hebrew Bible, through to the early church fathers, and so on, layer upon layer upon layer of reading. And that's, for me, that's the fascination, really, is that it's not just a kind of work of literature. It's a work of literary criticism as well. It's a self-consuming artifact. It's a self-reading document. And I've always kind of loved that about it. The other thing is, of course, that it's a collection of extraordinary stories, isn't it? And extraordinary characters that are things that, for me, because I've known them since I was a kid, but there's certain stories which stick with you, aren't they? That you're so vibrant, so lively, so mad at times that you just think, that I'll never forget that. So the stories like, you know, the great stories in Genesis of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and the Tower of Babel and the stories of Joseph, and you know, they're absolutely amazing stories. And that's part of what they contributed to literature, isn't it? Is that that they're just so compelling that we keep retelling them in various ways, and we can't escape them, can we? We just keep going back to them, you know. Yeah, you know, could go on all day about that, can we really?
But why? I mean, when I first read the Book of Job, many years ago, it struck me as a work of modern existentialism. And the bit that I couldn't get over, and no one's ever shown where I'm going wrong, is that God appears, of course, at the end of the book, but not in that favourable a light. He comes across as a bombast, someone that won't answer questions, and basically tells Job, get on with it. And you think, well, this is a book in the Bible. Someone somewhere, or I know there's probably more than one author, but somebody somewhere and somebody else somewhere else has sat down and asked themselves, what does it mean to be a human being when you're on the receiving end? I mean, what does all that mean? I find that an extraordinary atheistic document, because God comes off rather badly. You know, an atheistic document in the very heart of the Old Testament. What do you make of that, Kevin?
Yeah, well, it is an extraordinary thing, and as we've said, what is it doing in the Bible? How on earth did it get in there? It seems to me that the number of ways of reading it are pretty much infinite, aren't they? And it has been read in so many different ways. So that there's a traditional Christian reading, isn't there, which says something like, well, you know, what the Book of Job shows us is that the ways of God are hidden from men. We can't possibly understand God's morality and, you know, exactly who or what God is. He's just greater than us, and leave it in His hands. Don't worry about it. But of course, if you read it more carefully, you think to yourself, well, actually, God doesn't come out very well from this because He's inconsistent. You know, on the one hand, He says to Job, you know, at the end of it, He says, Job is right. He's spoken the truth. On the other hand, and He says to Job's friends, well, you know, you've not spoken true like Job has. But at the same time, what the friends have said to Job throughout the book have actually proved absolutely right, because God behaves in exactly the way they predict He'll behave. So it doesn't make sense, and it kind of doesn't add up. It leaves these questions hanging. But what it's doing in the Bible, I don't know. I mean, it's comparable, isn't it, to some other texts in some ways. So aspects of Egyptian text, you know, some Egyptian texts which are quite similar. But at the same time, it's also not like them. You know, in some ways, it's completely unlike those texts. You know, there are those texts from the ancient world which say similar things, or why do good people suffer? You know, I'm innocent, or I'm suffering, and those other texts tend to say, yeah, well, you are, but you know, it'll be okay. You just stick with it, and eventually the gods will, you know, do justice, do right by you. So you can see that there's a kind of set of questions which emerge in the ancient world about this, aren't there?
Yeah.
Do we get what we deserve, or do innocent people ultimately suffer? So it's a big question, I think, in the ancient world, and I think the Book of Job just deals with it in a way that perhaps nobody else dared to. I don't know.
What intrigues me about your work is that you're aware that big questions were being asked in the past, and people didn't shirk from them. They do nowadays. Our ancestors didn't hide from the big questions. I mean, that's one of the things that impresses me about your work. Aldona, we're speaking about human suffering. That's something to do with nursing. I imagine you've got another question brewing.
No, my question not about nursing. I would like to ask you, I know you are also a poet. How does poetry allow you to express ideas that academic writing cannot?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a huge question, but it's a great one. Yeah.
That got both of us laughing. That got both of us laughing.
Yeah. Okay. I suppose that there are different ways of understanding that set of relationships between creative writing and critical writing, I guess, is one way of putting it. I've never really accepted that distinction, the creative and the critical, I suppose, partly because I grew up intellectually reading authors who were determined to break down that distinction. People like Jeffrey Hartman, and Derrida too, and a tradition in Europe that goes back to Nietzsche, and in English it goes back to somebody like Thomas Carlyle. Just a kind of refusal to say this is critical, this is creative. And Oscar Wilde, of course, famously says that the critical is the creative, and the creative is the critical. There is that kind of tradition in English writing which goes through people like Oscar Wilde, or Carlyle, Wilde, J.E. Spingarn, and then into the kind of Anglo-American tradition, I guess. And for me, discovering that was wonderful, really. When I remember first reading Criticism in the Wilderness by Jeffrey Hartman when I was an undergraduate, and thinking, this is fantastic. This is what I've always thought, that creative thinking is critical and critical thinking is creative. And so my academic work, I've always tried to acknowledge that, I think. Even back as far as my PhD, I think I was doing that to some extent because I was reading Derrida, and Derrida's work is full of kind of poetry in a way. It's full of metaphors and explorations of metaphor, questions about metaphor. So they've always been kind of co-implicated, and I've always tried to work with that. However, having said that, the collections of poetry are different from the critical works. So even though I think the critical and the creative are co-implicated, I also think that for me, they have different functions. So when I'm writing essays about literature, critical essays, I am thinking in a slightly different way and trying to do something different. I think what the poetry does is gives me freedom from any academic constraints. So even though a lot of my poetry is actually based in research, I feel a kind of freedom, a liberty which isn't, you can kind of duck out of the academic frameworks and, the kind of necessity for creating references and bibliographies and citations. And you can play with it, and you can take the past, and if you're writing critically, you have a duty, I think, to be accurate, and you have a duty, a responsibility to be accurate and to get things right. With poetry, you can do what you like. You don't have a duty to be accurate. You can play around with stuff. You can alter it. You can change it. So I think it's the two sides. They're not different in a way. They are closely related. Sorry, they are different. They're just closely related but distinct, I guess. But I've always loved doing both. And I think I always will, as long as I'm able to think about these things. Yes, I think I'll always want to do both, I think.
Well, I mean, I suppose I'll jump in there. I mean, you've had me wondering since we first met if everything I write isn't just an apology to Derrida. There's no way around that man. There is no way around that man. He has to be faced and he has to be dealt with. And as I say, when I first approached you, I was really tempted to write something on Saint Derrida. Fortunately, you talked me out of it, because that would have been just awful. Theatre. Now, I wear a clerical hat of a sort. I also wear a theatrical hat. And I suppose part of my the larger part of my reputation is as a British theatrical, I suppose. I have never found a clash or a distinction between poetry, drama, theatre practice, and criticism. I know I'm not alone in that. So I'm not sort of raising my own petard there, raising my own flags there. I know from the work you do with your brother, I believe, Vic, some absolutely sterling work in theatre.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I mean, because you're raising the consciousness of the local community, no mean feat. You're reminding local people of the rich heritage that's so easily abandoned nowadays. And you're bringing poetry, you're bringing song, you're bringing enactment into contemporation as a theatrical project. How did all that start, Kevin? And do you feel you ever need to hold back, or it's just all guns blazing?
Okay. We had a very particular start. First of all, my brother Vic is a lifelong theatre buff, and writer, a dramatist, director, and actor, and has been since his 20s, if I remember rightly. It's a long time ago now. We're both very old, and he's an award-winning dramatist, an award-winning director. He now is a co-art director of the Liverpool International Amateur Theatre. It's amateur, I think it's amateur. Anyway, the Liverpool International Theatre Festival. So theatre is very much my brother's world rather than mine. Theatre was never really my world, although I've always enjoyed going to the theatre. I wasn't really involved in. I used to go and see Vic's productions, and even occasionally acted in those productions. Which was a mistake. I'm not an actor. That theatre has always been part of my consciousness because, you know, of talking to Vic and being aware of Vic's work. Then back in around 2015, I think, I came across these stories of a Welsh saint called Catwg, English Caddock, and I thought there's amazing stories about this Welsh saint from very much around where I live, my part of the world, Southeast Wales. And nobody knew these stories. They seem to have kind of vanished from the culture, really. And I read these stories and I thought, God, these are amazing, you know, to do something with these stories. So initially what I did was I wrote a sequence of poems based on some of the stories. But sadly, it's sad but true that nobody reads poetry and nobody buys poetry. So I thought, what else can I do with these stories that'll, you know, bring them to a wider audience?
Yeah.
So I thought, oh, well, I'll talk to Vic. I'll see what Vic can do with it. See if we can do some theatre based on it. So I gave some material to Vic, and he found this one episode, and he thought, oh yeah, I can see the drama in this. We can do a play based on this. So he wrote a play based on an episode from the life of St. Caddock. I wrote a few more poems to go in the drama, and we decided that we would because in Southeast Wales there are a lot of churches dedicated to Caddock and Catwg. So what we did was we went to them and said, can we perform our play about your saint in your church? So we did a tour of South Wales churches named after Caddock, and took the play into these churches. And in order to do that, we set up a little company. Initially, we just set it up for this one play. It's called Contemporanean Theatre, Vic's term, Contemporanean. And we got some money, got some funding, so we employed professional actors. And then it was such great fun. We thought, let's do this again. So then we got involved in a cities of refuge project and did another, and from there the thing has grown. So now we've got a professional filmmaker, we've got a professional musician, and we tend to produce these kind of multimedia pieces, which are plays with poems, songs, film. Yeah, so it's just grown from there. And we are now working on another production. We've done, was it 4, I think, so far, and we're just we're busy preparing the next one, looking for funding for the next one.
I know the problem. Aldona, another question. What do you think of theatre, young lady?
I think it's very important today to connecting history to contemporary life. It's really very interesting, amazing project. Really, it's yeah. I'm very excited to hear about this project. It's really interesting. Yeah, and I would like to ask you. What advice would you give to young writers and thinkers exploring their own creative and intellectual journeys?
Yeah, it's so difficult. So difficult now.
Oh, yes, but maybe you got some advice.
Yeah. There are a number of difficulties, really, I think, for young writers. I think it's very difficult to get anything published now. But of course, there are different platforms than there were when I was growing up. But I can't talk about them because I don't know anything about them. I'm digitally incompetent. I'm semi-illiterate when it comes to anything digital, really. As you can tell, I can't even get the sound right on my laptop. So, I think that probably young writers have to take advantage of those resources, those platforms, those openings, because I think the traditional ones that I grew up with are not really there very much now. So, like, for example, if you want to write fiction, fiction publishing is now dominated by celebrities, isn't it? They'll publish a novel if you're already famous for something else. Poetry, yes, there are poetry's doing well in Wales, to be fair, and there are a lot of small presses and publishing poetry, but nobody buys it really. It's it's a very poets tend to be a small group of people speaking to each other, really, which is a bit sad, but it's the way it is. So I think if you're a writer, you're a writer. You're going to write whatever, aren't you? And that's just the way it is. I've written all my life. I've written since I was a kid. And without any thought of publishing, to be honest, I didn't think about it. I just wrote because I wanted to write, and I still do. And I've now got about 3 volumes of poetry. I don't know what to do with, frankly, because I don't think anybody will publish them. So I'll just hang on to them, and I think that's the best advice I can give to young writers is do what you do. And do it for yourself and take advantage of any openings you can find. If there are openings there, yes, take advantage of them. There are online journals, online magazines, and various kind of platforms that you can employ. But, if you're a writer, you're going to write whatever, I think.
Well, it
sounds a bit grim, doesn't it?
Well, that's reality. That's reality. I'll dive in there because, again, we're touching upon theatrical issues indirectly. Writers just write, William Burroughs, writers just write. And you've just confirmed that. I think that's true. It's not about accolades. It's about even young Aldona. I mean, she writes because she writes. She's a proper writer. What intrigues me is the crossover between words, sentences, grammar, and drama. Now, what struck me with your recent, which I'd have loved to have been able to see, For the Love of Merthyr. Of course, Merthyr Tydfil, for those who don't know, is an area in Wales, quite a deprived area as far as I recall. For the Love of Merthyr was a show you and Vic worked on recently. I mean, I saw some of the adverts on social media and was exceedingly impressed. And I loved the whole sort of 50s sort of
40s,
avant-garde.
48.
Well, yeah, the same aesthetic,
Yeah, yeah.
avant-garde, futuristic, optimism. The optimism was in the songs, it was in the costumes, it was in the wording. And the dichotomy of writing something optimistic about a good time in Merthyr's history against the backdrop of what's happening in Merthyr now struck me as brave, struck me as foolhardy as well, if I'm honest, but struck me as absolutely vital and necessary. So, I mean, what motivated that project, and do you think it achieved the aim you'd set yourself?
What motivated, there are a number of things motivated it really. The one was it was connected with the NHS and the various anniversaries we've had with the NHS. We felt that we wanted to do something to celebrate the NHS, and there was a play with Michael Sheen called Nye, a play about Nye Bevan and the founding of the NHS, and it was very successful, did very well. It was in I think it was the Millennium Centre in Cardiff. So we didn't want to repeat that. We didn't want to do Nye Bevan. Now, to one of our directors, and the person who directed For the Love of Merthyr is himself a Merthyr boy. So 1948, the NHS was founded in 1948. 1948 was also the year in which Hoover, the electrical company, opened a huge factory in Merthyr. And at the time, it was a world-leading factory. They were their production lines were far in advance of what anybody had done before, really. And that fitted into a history in Merthyr of industrial firsts. It was one of the leaders of the Industrial Revolution. The production of iron and steel, and then of course coal. So it had always been at the kind of traditionally it had been at the forefront of the world industrialization. So Merthyr is this place with extraordinary history. It was the first real town of any size in Wales, and was the biggest town in Wales before Cardiff developed in the coal boom in the 20s. So it had an extraordinary history. It also had associated with the Merthyr Rising, with the government repression of the workers, the killing of workers, who were on strike because of the appalling conditions. So it had this fantastic history, Merthyr, which we thought deserved to be celebrated. So we thought, right, 1948, NHS, Hoover arrives. Let's do this great show about Merthyr in 1948. And in order to do that, we got people, the local community involved. Famous people from Merthyr read bits of the poem for us on the film. We had schools involved in the production. And then we staged it 4 nights in Merthyr itself. It's not been anywhere else. It's just performed in Merthyr. So we focused on that town and did it for Merthyr people, and getting them to think about their own history, to celebrate their own history, and got lovely feedback, particularly from the schools, of youngsters who didn't know their own history. They didn't know about the past. And that seemed to me to be really profoundly important. That you've got these young kids in yes, as you say, it's not a very wealthy area. It's a relatively deprived area. These youngsters learning about how important their town is, and that matters. If you can base optimism on anything, it's that, isn't it? That young people have a strong sense of identity, of belonging, and of pride in their past, the pride in their history, pride in their roots. So it was fantastic. It was a wonderful experience, and the people of Merthyr responded brilliantly. They seem to have loved it. So it was a great project and well worthwhile, I think.
Absolutely, no doubt people loved it. Of course, young Aldona used to work in the NHS. I don't think you do nowadays. Being a senior figure.
I worked on NHS in hospitals, when I when I came to this country. Yes, I used to work in hospitals, but most time I worked in private, private nursing homes.
I seem to recall reading in your book, Nurse Stories, that you were horrified about how simple-minded the training was here compared to Lithuania.
Oh, yes.
I can believe that.
I was lucky, really, at the time, yeah. It
Well,
was
I'll tell you,
surprising.
that this conversation, I mean, I certainly, Lithuania, some of the countries we work with, Aldona, they would really resonate and understand Welsh history. They'd understand the deprivations, they'd understand the struggle in a way I think English people never will. But maybe that's something for a future conversation. Any other questions for Kevin, Aldona?
No, actually, I asked what I wanted to ask, and I'm really happy. And thank you so much, Professor Mills, for this inspiring conversation and your project and work bridges centuries, ideas and forms of expressions. And it has been a joy to explore these worlds with you, really. It's very interesting. And thank you, dear David, for joining me once again on this beautiful literary journey. As usual, we have really a nice show, and I love it. I love this conversation with intelligent people, with writers. And thank you for watching Literary Bridges, Writers on Writing. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe for more conversations with extraordinary writers and thinkers. Until next time, keep reading, keep creating, and keep building your own literary bridges. Bye.